Russia launched a full-scale war against Ukraine on February 24, 2022. On the one hand, all Western politicians and analysts have already been talking about the possibility of such an event over the past couple of months. On the other hand, many consider such a scenario unlikely, as such a company would bring huge costs to Russia. However, the war has begun. And in this issue, we'll talk about why Putin, nevertheless, decided to go to war and what are the reasons for this. The first reason is the most obvious, the failure of Russian diplomacy, a major escalation between Russia on the one hand, Ukraine, and the West on the other. It began back in November 2021, so it was then that the first reports of a possible Russian attack on Ukraine appeared, although Russia itself denied such a possibility all the time. However, it was from November 2021 that a significant grouping of troops began to build up on the Russian-Ukrainian border, which by the time the war began reached 182,100. And so the demands of the Russian side followed in a curve of escalation. The main requirement for Ukraine was the implementation of the Minsk agreements, thanks to which Ukraine would be able to regain control over the lost territories in the Donbass, but it would be forced to give these territories a special status. Such an autonomy for the region could bring the whole of Ukraine under Russian control, and the Donbass would have the right to veto any legislative initiatives in Ukraine, which would cut Ukraine off from the Western world. Requirements for Western countries were even more extensive, so in December 2021, the Russian side set a number of requirements to the countries, which were also called an ultimatum in the West. The main points were guarantees from NATO countries or United States that Ukraine and Georgia would never join NATO, and the question was also raised about the return of NATO by 1998 and the withdrawal of weapons from countries that entered later this year. Despite a series of negotiations in various formats between the countries, Russia has not achieved any results. Apparently, a failed series of negotiations pushed Putin to resolve the issue by military means. The second reason is the complete subjugation of Belarus over the past couple of years. The presidential elections in Belarus in 2020 were a turning point in the modern history of the country. As the result of these elections were mass protests and rallies against the Lukashenko regime, which ultimately failed. The failure of the rallies led to a tightening of the regime, and most importantly, to the loss of the legitimacy of Lukashenko's presidency. In European countries, Belarus turned out to be completely cut off from Europe economically, and the Lukashenko regime was able to maintain its power solely thanks to Russia. So over the past couple of years, Belarus has actually become vassals of Russia, and the multi-vector nature of the country was lost even before the start of the war. Many Western analysts consider different scenarios and the influence of the Russian army, and in this regard, an important question arose: whether the Russian army would attack Ukraine from Belarus. The answer to this question, we already know why it was so important, because an effective attack on Kiev was possible only from the Belarusian side, given the location of the city. The nearest Russian city, Novaya Yurkovich, is located at a distance of 250 kilometers from Kiev. Given the dependence of the Belarus on Russia, the Russian command was able to carry out an attack from Belarus. The third reason is the elimination of the opposition and any dissent on the territory of Russia. Russia's authoritarian power has been growing stronger for more than a decade. The country has long had problems with elections, with a free press, with human rights, and so on. However, such processes began to accelerate with particular zeal from the year 2020, when the coronavirus epidemic began. Strict quarantine measures around the world have allowed authoritarian leaders to significantly strengthen their power. Restriction of the rights and freedoms of citizens took place under the slogans of protecting citizens from disease. However, in fact, there was an usurpation of power. Any rallies and protests were prohibited due to the dangerous epidemiological situation. Similar processes have not bypassed Russia. If even in 1919 there was an opposition in the country, even if it was non-systemic, there were independent media and human rights organizations. And in 2021, there was nothing of the sort. Any dissent was suppressed. Oppositionists or potential opponents of the authorities were imprisoned, or they were forced to flee. Independent media began to be massively banned and called foreign agents, and human rights organizations were liquidated one after another. Even the memorial that investigated the victims of totalitarian regime was banned on the territory of Russia. Strengthening the authoritarian regime unleashed the hands of the authorities, which made the war against Ukraine possible. The fourth reason is the global crisis caused by the coronavirus epidemic. The coronavirus epidemic was an extreme surprise for the entire world community. Countries for the first time in 100 years faced such a large-scale epidemic and were shocked by the ongoing spread of diseases, and subsequent lockdowns led to serious political and economic crises, especially in Europe and the United States. Economic recession of inflation, shortages, dissatisfaction with mandatory vaccination and restrictions, bankruptcy of entrepreneurs, and so on. All these problems put the Western countries in a difficult position, which made it possible for Russia to go on the offensive. In Russia, of course, exactly the same problems began. But with the strengthening of the authoritarian regime, the discontent of the population is leveled much easier than in liberal democracies. Separately, it's worth noting gas prices, which at the end of 2021 jumped to record levels of 2000s. It also caused an energy crisis in Western countries. In general, such a crisis situation added the decisiveness of Russia regarding the upcoming war against Ukraine. The fifth reason is a certain historical mission of Russia and Putin, which Putin himself and his bros are convinced of. Even before the start of the war, while discussing the pragmatism and costs of a possible war between Russia and Ukraine, analysts noticed that such a conflict had no purely practical meaning. However, on February 21 of 2021, when Putin delivered a long speech about Ukraine, Russia and their history, it became clear to everyone that the practical part of the issue was not of particular interest to Putin himself. Putin's hour-long speech was devoted to historical grievances against Western countries and Ukraine, and also at the heart of the speech was some kind of historical justice, which the Putin regime is allegedly restoring. In general, Putin has a rather distorted idea of the history of Russia and Ukraine. Based on this understanding of the issue, it becomes clear that the priority is a certain idea constructed by Putin himself, and not some real pragmatic or rational reasons. It was this understanding of the issue that became the key to the start of a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. Separately, it's worth saying a few words about the course of the operation. The war launched against Ukraine was apparently planned for a fairly short time. Many Western analysts say this, as well as indirect factors, such as a lack of provisions a week after the invasion. In the Russian media, in particular in RIA Novosti, on February 26, 2 days after the start of the war, an article even appeared about the capture of Kiev and Ukraine and its further peace order. In general, the Russian side considered that the war that had begun would end as soon as possible, which would not lead to large losses, and that it could raise the ratings of their power, as it happened with Crimea. Well, and that this would make Ukraine dependent on Russia. Such plans, as we see, did not materialize, which has already led to serious costs for Russia. Also, the Russian side did not count on such large-scale sanctions from Western countries. Summing up, it's worth saying that Putin decided on a military conflict in Ukraine because of the complete failure of Russian diplomacy, and because of the subjugation of Belarus and the elimination of the opposition, and because of the global crisis, and in the end, because of the idea of historical justice. If you find this video interesting and informative, don't forget to smash the like button and turn on all notifications and subscribe my channel so you don't miss any of my videos. And see you in the next video. Peace.